He had everything: money, power, the perfect woman by his side, until two street kids in pink t-shirts whispered 6 words that shattered his world: "Don't trust that woman with you." Andrew Carlyle was the kind of man who turned heads when he walked into a room. At only 36, he had built one of the most successful construction empires on the West Coast, headquartered in a sleek glass tower in downtown Los Angeles. Every inch of him spoke of control, from the tailored light brown suits he always wore to the careful way he listened before speaking. His eyes were a deep, steady brown, and his hair was kept impeccably styled. But beyond his confidence and wealth, there was something quieter in him, something that made people trust him almost instinctively. He had no close family, no wife, no children. His life revolved around his company and a small circle of trusted employees. Or at least, people he thought he could trust. Chief among them was his executive assistant, Victoria Brooks. She had been by his side for nearly 4 years, climbing quickly from office intern to personal aide and, more recently, becoming his romantic partner. She was elegant, sharp, always knowing the right thing to say at meetings, and she had a kind of polished beauty that drew attention without demanding it. Their relationship had evolved slowly, from shared late nights at the office to occasional dinners, and finally into something that resembled love, or what Andrew thought might be love. To many, Victoria was the perfect match for him: ambitious, intelligent, and fiercely loyal. She knew the ins and outs of the company, handled sensitive matters with grace, and could switch from business mode to intimate conversation in a heartbeat. Andrew had come to rely on her, not only professionally but emotionally. For a man who had built everything himself, giving his heart to someone was a decision he did not make lightly. On a warm Thursday afternoon, they shared lunch on the office balcony, laughing over a private joke, as they overlooked the buzzing city below. From the outside, everything appeared flawless. But inside Andrew's mind, a quiet voice sometimes whispered that maybe things were too perfect. He always silenced it, telling himself he was just being cautious, the way he always had to be in business. After all, Victoria had never given him a real reason to doubt her. That evening, as the sun set behind the skyline and the building's reflection turned golden, Andrew finished the last of his emails and walked toward the elevators. The night was calm, the streets below glowing in amber hues. He had no idea that within the next 24 hours, his entire perception of trust would be shattered, not by a boardroom betrayal, not by a rival corporation, but by 2 little girls in pink t-shirts. As Andrew stepped out of the building's lobby that evening, the warm dusk air met him like a quiet exhale. The sky was still streaked with faded orange and soft lavender, the last remnants of the setting sun lingering above the skyline. He loosened his tie slightly, more out of habit than discomfort, and walked toward the circular fountain in front of the tower. The fountain was a quiet place, tucked away from the rush of downtown traffic, a rare corner of peace in the city's chaos. He often paused there in the evenings, sometimes taking calls, sometimes just enjoying a few moments of stillness before heading home. Tonight, he noticed something unusual. 2 small figures were sitting at the edge of the fountain, their backs turned toward him, their legs dangling just above the water. He slowed his pace. At first he assumed they were waiting for someone, perhaps their mother was nearby. But as he got closer, he realized they were alone. The 2 girls looked almost identical, tiny, maybe 6 years old, with long blonde hair tied into messy ponytails, wearing faded light pink t-shirts and worn-out jeans. Their shoes were old, mismatched, the kind that suggested they hadn't been bought recently or maybe not even new. They looked up at him as he approached, and their bright blue eyes locked onto his with an eerie kind of focus. Before he could say a word, both girls stood and walked directly up to him. There was no hesitation, no shyness, just a strange, urgent confidence in their steps. The taller one, or maybe just the slightly older twin, stopped inches from him and said clearly, "Don't trust that woman." The word struck him like a cold gust of wind. For a second, he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. He looked down at them, trying to process what they had just said. "I'm sorry, what?" he asked, more confused than alarmed. They didn't blink. The same girl repeated, this time slower, don't trust her. The woman you're with. Andrew blinked, the smallest hint of unease beginning to settle in his chest. He glanced around. No adult in sight. Just these two kids, standing under the soft glow of the fountain lights, speaking like messengers from a dream, or a nightmare. Why would you say something like that? He asked, his voice lower now, more cautious. The second girl spoke this time. Because we see things. We live right over there. She pointed across the street to a half-abandoned parking structure, the kind city planners had long forgotten. We watch people. And we've seen her. First, she was with you. The first girl continued, without missing a beat. Then she was with another man. A man with glasses. Tall. They hug like she hugs you. We saw them a few times. Then we listened, and we heard her say something. Andrew was silent. His breath caught slightly. He already knew who they were talking about. A man with glasses. Tall. That could only mean one person, Justin Morrow. His friend. His business partner. What did she say? He asked, almost not wanting to know the answer. The taller twin answered without pause. She told him you were too busy to notice. That you wouldn't know what was happening until it was too late. She said they'd take your company. They laughed about it. Andrew stared at them. These were children, dirty, probably hungry, maybe confused, but there was nothing in their tone or expression that suggested they were lying. They didn't even seem to want anything from him. No begging, no asking for help, just a sharp, clear warning from two little girls who had seen far too much of the world. You were watching us? He asked quietly. No, one of them said, shaking her head. We weren't trying to. But when you live outside, you see everything. You see what's real. The word struck deeper than he expected. He looked at them again, really looked this time. The tired eyes, the way they stood close together like they were each other's only protection, the quiet seriousness in their voices, it all painted a picture no child should ever have to live in. He felt something shift inside him. A kind of quiet dread. A recognition. And something else too, respect. He knelt down slightly, trying to look them both in the eyes at their level. What are your names? He asked. The girls hesitated, then answered in unison. Lily. Sophie. He nodded slowly, their names now etched into his memory. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with what they told him, but he knew this much, he couldn't ignore it. Not the warning. Not the girls. Not the strange pull in his gut that told him this moment was about to change everything. The ride home that night was a blur for Andrew. He sat in the back of his black town car, his eyes fixed on the passing lights of the city, but his mind was locked in the voices of the two little girls. Lily and Sophie. Their words echoed again and again, don't trust her. Every syllable had carried weight, more than he thought possible coming from 6-year-olds. He tried to dismiss it at first, tried to remind himself that children sometimes misunderstand what they see. But the certainty in their eyes and the consistency in their story made that impossible. They hadn't stuttered. They hadn't searched for words. They had delivered the truth as simply as if they were telling him what they had for breakfast. That night, he barely slept. His penthouse was quiet, the kind of silent that echoed in the bones. He walked from room to room, not even turning on the lights, letting the dim city glow cast long shadows on the walls. He replayed conversations with Victoria, watched them in his head like clips from an old film. Her compliments, her careful attention to his schedule, her warmth in private moments, all of it had felt real. And maybe it was. But now, there was a doubt, and it was like a hairline crack across glass, barely visible at first, but destined to spread. By the next morning, the doubt had grown into something closer to suspicion. Andrew was not the type of man who acted on emotion without evidence. He had built his company by being analytical, by spotting threats early and neutralizing them with precision. And so, he did what he knew how to do, he started observing. Quietly. From a distance. Without telling anyone. He reached out to Daniel, his most discreet security advisor, someone who had once worked intelligence before moving into private corporate work. Andrew gave him one simple instruction: watch Victoria, but don't let her know she's being watched. Look into her recent movements, her meetings outside of work, her communications, discreetly, legally. Daniel didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and got to work. In the meantime, Andrew began paying closer attention at the office. He noticed small things he hadn't before. Victoria's frequent texts during meetings, her occasional disappearances for quick errands, the way her tone changed slightly whenever Justin's name came up in conversation. None of it was damning on its own, but together, it began to form a picture that unsettled him. A week passed. Then another. Daniel returned with findings. What he uncovered wasn't dramatic at first, mostly patterns. Victoria had met with Justin Morrow 4 times in the last 3 weeks, all outside the office, all unaccounted for in her calendar. One meeting was in a hotel lounge on the west side of town. Another was a lunch in Beverly Hills where they entered the restaurant separately but left together. The third meeting, however, was the one that made Andrew's stomach turn. It was footage. Grainy, from a nearby traffic camera, but clear enough. Victoria stepping out of a black sedan. Justin already waiting. They didn't shake hands. They embraced. It wasn't a professional hug. It was long, familiar. Her hand had rested gently on the back of his neck the way she did with Andrew. She whispered something into Justin's ear, and he laughed. Then they walked away together. Andrew stared at the footage in silence. He asked Daniel to replay it. Then again. He didn't speak for nearly a minute after the screen went dark. All the noise in his mind seemed to evaporate. There it was. The crack in the glass had spread wide open. But even then, he didn't allow himself to feel anger. Not yet. He still needed one thing more, proof that this went beyond betrayal of the heart. Proof that it was also a threat to the company. He ordered Daniel to follow the money. Emails. Hidden accounts. Shell companies. Anything that might suggest collusion or a plan to take control of the business. While Daniel dug deeper, Andrew kept up appearances. He went to dinner with Victoria twice, even kissed her goodnight at the door of her apartment. Each time, he studied her expression, her movements, wondering how much of what she showed him was real and how much was performance. It was on a Friday afternoon when Daniel finally returned with a flash drive and a grim expression. He handed it to Andrew without speaking. Andrew inserted it into his laptop, opened the encrypted folder, and read through the documents. It was all there. A silent transfer of shares from minor investors to a dummy corporation linked to an account in Justin's name. A forged signature authorization that could, under the right conditions, give Victoria voting rights over a significant portion of the board. An email draft, never sent, but saved, outlining a plan to claim that Andrew was mentally unfit to lead due to increasing emotional instability, citing personal losses and erratic behavior. It was dated 2 days after the night he met Lily and Sophie. For a long time, Andrew didn't move. The betrayal wasn't just real, it was calculated. Cold. Precise. Victoria and Justin had crafted their plan meticulously, using his trust as their greatest weapon. He should have been angry. He should have felt rage or even heartbreak. But instead, he felt something entirely different: clarity. The girls had told the truth. 2 children who had nothing, who owed him nothing, had given him a gift that the people closest to him couldn't offer: honesty. And now, he knew what he had to do. It was early Monday morning when Andrew decided he couldn't wait any longer. The weekend had passed in a strange kind of stillness, the kind that comes not from peace but from calculation. He had reviewed every file, every document, every recorded detail more times than necessary. He wasn't looking for doubt anymore, he was studying the shape of betrayal. His mind wasn't clouded with anger or confusion, it was sharp, focused, and dangerously clear. And now it was time to act. He began with the board. Quietly, one-on-one meetings over the course of the day, just 15 to 20 minutes each. He didn't present the full weight of his findings. He didn't need to, not yet. Instead, he asked questions. Subtle, probing, designed to test where loyalties lay. Had anyone spoken to Victoria about long-term succession? Had Justin raised concerns about Andrew's leadership? The answers varied in wording, but one thing was consistent: people had been approached. Carefully. Indirectly. Whispered conversations, framed as speculation. Victoria had been planting the idea that Andrew was stretched thin, emotionally compromised, and perhaps in need of a sabbatical. Justin had been reinforcing that message from a supportive perspective, offering to temporarily step in if needed. It was a coordinated performance, and they had been perfecting it for months. By the time the last meeting ended, Andrew knew the extent of the rot. His trust had been weaponized, his generosity taken for granted. But he also knew the board wasn't fully on their side yet. They were cautious, observant, and most importantly, still unsure. That was his opening. He didn't need to convince them of his innocence. He only needed to show them the truth. That evening, he organized a private executive meeting under the pretense of a strategy review. He invited Victoria, Justin, and a few key board members. The meeting room was sleek, modern, all glass and marble, with a long polished table and a wall-sized screen. Everyone arrived with their tablets and coffee cups, expecting a routine session. Victoria wore her usual calm smile, greeting Andrew with the same warmth as always, as if nothing in the world had changed. Justin leaned casually in his chair, pretending to be distracted by something on his phone. Andrew stood at the head of the table and connected his laptop to the main screen. For a moment, the room remained silent except for the hum of the ceiling vent. Then he spoke. "I want to begin this meeting with something unusual," he said, his voice even. "Something personal. Something necessary." He clicked a button. The first video played, Victoria and Justin at the hotel lounge. Their embrace, the quiet laughter, the undeniable intimacy. Murmurs rose around the table. Then came the documents, file by file. Share transfers. Signature forgeries. Hidden accounts. And finally, the draft email suggesting his removal. No one spoke for a long time. Victoria's smile vanished slowly, her posture stiffening as she turned to glance at Justin. He looked pale, his fingers twitching slightly. Andrew remained quiet, letting the evidence speak for itself. When the last slide faded into black, he turned off the screen. "I trusted both of you," he said, his voice low but steady. "You had every opportunity to be part of something lasting. Instead, you chose deception. You built a plan to take everything I built, not through innovation, not through effort, but through manipulation." He turned to the board members in the room. "You deserve transparency. That's what I've always promised. Now you know the truth." The board was stunned but not indecisive. Questions followed, sharp and urgent. Victoria tried to defend herself, claimed misunderstanding, insisted the documents were out of context. Justin remained mostly silent, except for a few feeble attempts to suggest it was all a strategic misunderstanding. But it was too late. The damage was done. Within 48 hours, both were suspended pending legal review. The company's legal team launched a full internal audit, confirming everything Andrew had presented. By the end of the week, Victoria and Justin were officially terminated, and civil charges were filed. Their reputations, once polished and formidable, crumbled almost overnight. Andrew didn't celebrate. He didn't feel triumphant. There was only a sense of relief, like a storm had passed and left him standing. He had avoided catastrophe not because of a system or an advisor, but because two children who owed him nothing had spoken the truth. He couldn't stop thinking about them, Lily and Sophie, two little girls in pink shirts, living in the shadows, who had risked approaching a stranger just to do the right thing. And now that the storm had passed, he knew what his next step had to be. They had saved him. Now, he would find a way to save them. The following days were quieter than Andrew had anticipated. There were no more late-night strategy calls, no whispered conspiracies hidden behind closed office doors. The air in the building felt different, cleaner, still cautious but undeniably lighter. Employees who had once been wary around Victoria and Justin now walked with less tension, as if an invisible weight had lifted. But for Andrew, the aftermath was far from peaceful. He had won, yes, but the victory felt hollow. He had protected the company, preserved his position, and exposed the betrayal that could have destroyed everything he'd built. And yet, none of that changed the fact that it had all been so close to unraveling, right in front of him, and he hadn't seen it. He couldn't stop thinking about how blind he had been. It wasn't just about the business. He had let someone into his personal life, into the most private parts of his world, and that person had used him, not only to further her ambitions but to attempt to steal the very foundation of his identity. Andrew had always prided himself on being a good judge of character. That belief, once unshakable, had been thoroughly dismantled. It wasn't just his company they had tried to take. They had chipped away at his sense of self-worth, at the delicate core of who he was when no one else was watching. But through all of it, his thoughts kept returning to Lily and Sophie. The image of them standing near the fountain was burned into his memory like a vivid dream. He could still hear their voices, soft but certain, telling him not to trust the woman he believed he loved. They had no reason to speak to him that day, no incentive, no promise of reward, yet they had told him the truth with the clarity and fearlessness most adults never dared to show. He had to find them. Not because he felt obligated, but because he couldn't shake the feeling that they had appeared in his life for a reason. They had saved him. Now it was his turn to offer something in return. He reached out to his security team, not with an order, but with a request. He described the girls in detail, gave the estimated location where he had seen them, and asked them to start looking quietly. He didn't want them scared or forced into anything. He simply wanted to find them, to know they were safe, and maybe, just maybe, to offer them something more. Days passed. Then a week. His team combed the surrounding neighborhoods, asked gentle questions at shelters and community centers, spoke with local shopkeepers and residents. Most people hadn't seen anyone matching the girl's description. A few said they'd seen twins near an old van parked behind an abandoned gas station on the edge of town. When Andrew arrived there in person, he wasn't sure what to expect. The area was quiet, lined with cracked pavement and overgrown weeds. The gas station had long been boarded up, graffiti covering most of its exterior walls. But tucked behind it, half hidden by a broken chain-link fence, was a battered white van with a blue tarp stretched over part of the roof. It looked empty at first glance, but when he stepped closer, he noticed a small curtain move behind one of the windows. He called out softly, using their names. "Lily? Sophie? It's Andrew. The man from the fountain." There was a pause. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Lily peeked out first, her eyes cautious but sharp. Behind her, Sophie clutched a worn blanket. They didn't speak right away. They didn't run, but they didn't smile either. Andrew knelt a few feet away, keeping his tone gentle. "I'm not here to scare you. I just wanted to say thank you. You helped me more than you know. And I thought maybe I could help you now." They exchanged glances. Sophie looked unsure, but Lily stepped forward. "We don't want to go to a shelter," she said firmly. Andrew nodded. I understand. That's not what I'm offering. I'm offering something better. Somewhere safe. A real bed. Food every day. School. A place to be kids. You won't owe me anything. You already saved me. He didn't try to persuade them beyond that. He gave them space. He gave them time. Over the next few days, he returned regularly, never with a team, never with pressure. Just himself, bringing small things. Sandwiches. Warm socks. A drawing pad and markers. Slowly, the girls began to open up. He learned that their mother had passed away 2 years ago and their father had disappeared shortly after. They had survived by watching the world carefully, relying on their instincts, and on each other. Eventually, Lily asked the question he'd been waiting for. Where would we go? If we said yes? Andrew smiled for the first time in what felt like weeks. I have a place. It's quiet, big enough for 2 brave girls. And if you like it, it can be yours as long as you want. Not as charity. As a new chapter. And so, the process began. He hired a social worker and a private tutor, brought in legal guardianship professionals, and worked with the courts to ensure everything was done properly. Lily and Sophie moved into a guest house on his property at first, then slowly, over time, into his home itself. What started as an act of gratitude grew into something he hadn't expected: family. For the first time in years, the house felt alive. There were footsteps running down hallways, laughter echoing from the kitchen, drawings taped to the refrigerator. The emptiness that had once filled every room was gone. And through it all, Andrew healed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. He learned that sometimes, when everything falls apart, it makes room for something better to grow. Months passed, and the transformation inside Andrew's home was both subtle and profound. The once sterile halls of his glass and steel mansion now echoed with the quiet rhythm of daily life. Shoes were left by the front door, mismatched socks appeared in the laundry, and the sound of cartoons drifted from the living room every Saturday morning. The girls, Lily and Sophie, were no longer the wary streetwise children who had approached him near the fountain with guarded eyes and guarded hearts. Though the past still lingered in the way they hesitated when meeting new people or how they instinctively watched every exit in a room, they had begun to let go of their constant vigilance. Trust was not immediate, but it grew, piece by piece, and Andrew never rushed it. He hired a tutor named Grace, an experienced, kind-hearted woman in her 50s with a gentle voice and a background in trauma-informed education. She came to the house 5 days a week, creating a routine the girls had never known. At first, Lily resisted. She was defensive, skeptical, always asking, "Why do we need to learn this?" But Grace handled her with patience, explaining that knowledge gave power, and that understanding the world was the best way to protect themselves from it. Sophie, more reserved but also more curious, took to the lessons with quiet enthusiasm. She liked books, especially stories about people who overcame impossible odds. Andrew would often find her curled up in the sunroom with a biography or a history book nearly too big for her small frame. Slowly, their personalities emerged more clearly. Lily was bold and fiercely protective, with a sharp wit and a restless energy that kept her moving, questioning, always needing something to build or fix or understand. She began to take an interest in Andrew's architectural work, especially the blueprints he often left on his desk. One afternoon, she asked if she could try designing her own building, and when he gave her permission, she spent hours drawing a 2-story house with bedrooms for people who don't have anywhere else to go. Sophie, on the other hand, had a calm steadiness to her. She paid attention to everything and noticed small details that others missed. She once pointed out a loophole in one of Andrew's old contracts just by reading over his shoulder. When he asked how she had spotted it, she shrugged and said, "It just didn't seem fair." They were different, but together, they balanced each other in a way that was quietly remarkable. Andrew often watched them with a kind of awe. He had spent so many years alone, surrounded by people but never truly known, and now these two small girls had entered his life like a storm and then settled like sunlight after the rain. They asked him questions he had never been asked before: what his favorite ice cream was, whether he believed in ghosts, if he had ever cried in front of anyone. When he said yes to that last one, they looked at each other, then at him, and Sophie simply said, "Good. That means you're real." Despite all the progress, Andrew never let himself forget where they came from. He kept a close relationship with a child psychologist who helped guide him on how to support their healing. He didn't speak much about Victoria or Justin to them, but one evening, when Lily asked whether the woman they had warned him about was still trying to hurt you, he said something that stayed with them both: "Not anymore. But I wouldn't have seen the danger without you." That answer seemed to satisfy them, not because it made the past disappear, but because it acknowledged the role they had played. It validated their story in a world that so often ignored children like them. The more time Andrew spent with them, the more his own life began to shift. His days no longer ended at the office. He came home earlier, cooked meals with the girls, badly at first, until Sophie took over most of the recipe reading, and even allowed Friday night movie traditions, which usually ended with popcorn spilled on the rug and someone falling asleep before the credits rolled. His housekeeper, Maria, who had worked for him for nearly a decade, told him one afternoon as she wiped down the kitchen counter, "You're a different man now. A better one. They brought light into this place." And it was true. He had spent years building his empire brick by brick, chasing legacy, proving something to a world that had doubted him when he was young and struggling. But legacy, he realized now, wasn't in buildings or contracts. It was in the way Lily's eyes lit up when she solved a math problem on her own, in the quiet pride Sophie showed when she explained a complicated sentence she had written, and in the way both girls leaned against him on the couch without asking if it was okay. One day, without ceremony or preamble, Lily called him Dad for the first time. It happened in the middle of a conversation about fixing a broken light fixture. She said, "Dad, do you think I could try to fix it myself?" And Andrew froze, the wrench in his hand halfway to the table. He didn't correct her. He didn't want to make it into a moment. He just said, "Yeah. I think you can." That night, he stood in the doorway of their room long after they had fallen asleep, the soft sound of their breathing the most comforting thing he had ever heard. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to plan every detail. He no longer feared vulnerability. It had led him to something better than control. It had led him home. Spring arrived quietly, the way it always did in Los Angeles, without the dramatic thaw of snow or the sudden bloom of forgotten flowers. But something about the air felt different to Andrew this year. It was lighter, almost hopeful. The gray tones of the past seemed to fade just slightly, making room for new beginnings. Lily and Sophie were thriving, no longer just surviving. They had settled into their routines with remarkable ease: school, home, reading time, and the occasional trip to the beach or the science center. Their world had grown from the hard edges of the street to the soft curves of trust, and Andrew, still adjusting to the role of parent, found himself changing with them. It was during one of Sophie's tutoring sessions that he met Jane Miller. Grace, their longtime tutor, had decided to retire and personally recommended Jane as a replacement. She described her as bright, warm, and firm in the way children need. Andrew agreed to meet her, but he kept his expectations low. It wasn't that he doubted Grace's judgment, it was that trust still came slowly, especially when it came to people entering the girls' lives. Jane arrived early on a Tuesday morning. She wore a simple blue blouse and carried a leather satchel filled with books, her brown hair pulled back in a loose knot. When she entered the room, her eyes went first to the girls, not Andrew, and her smile wasn't the polished kind meant to impress. It was the genuine, unforced smile of someone who liked children and saw them as people, not projects. Lily was immediately skeptical, sitting with her arms crossed, while Sophie observed silently, as she always did. But Jane didn't push. She sat down, asked a few questions, and then, without hesitation, told them a short story about how she once got lost inside a school library and accidentally spent the night reading under a pile of encyclopedias. It wasn't dramatic, but it made Sophie laugh, and even Lily's mouth twitched in the hint of a smile. Andrew watched from the hallway. He wasn't sure what he had been expecting, but it wasn't this calm, this natural ease. Jane didn't try to charm him. In fact, she barely acknowledged him beyond a polite greeting. Her focus was entirely on the girls, on how they learned, how they processed the world, how they reacted to being challenged or praised. Over the weeks that followed, her presence became something solid, almost invisible in its consistency. She showed up every day with the same quiet energy and, somehow, managed to make the girls both think harder and laugh more. It took Andrew a while to speak to her beyond small talk. Their conversation started with logistics, progress reports, lesson adjustments, Sophie's growing interest in law, Lily's obsession with geometry. But those conversations gradually deepened. One afternoon, after the girls had run outside for a break, Andrew offered Jane a cup of coffee, and they sat in the kitchen. They talked about education, of course, but then about other things, childhood memories, travel, the ways people reinvent themselves after failure. He learned she had once been a high school teacher, had left after a personal tragedy she didn't yet explain, and had spent the past 3 years working with children from unstable homes. What struck him most was how unafraid she was of silence. She didn't rush to fill gaps in conversation. She listened without judgment, asked questions without turning them into interrogations. Over time, Andrew began to look forward to those moments, those small, steady conversations that grounded him in something outside his business world, outside his past mistakes. The shift between them was slow. There were no grand declarations or sudden sparks. It was the way she always remembered to bring Sophie an extra notepad, knowing she liked to write her thoughts at night. It was the way she encouraged Lily to explain her ideas rather than just get the right answer. And it was the way she spoke to Andrew, not as the man with money or power, but simply as a human being trying to do his best with the fragile pieces he had been given. Their first dinner together happened almost by accident. Jane stayed late helping Lily finish a complicated project, and when Andrew offered to order food, she agreed. They sat at the table long after the girls had gone to bed, talking about nothing in particular, sharing quiet laughter, and by the end of the night, Andrew realized he hadn't checked his phone once. It felt like the most honest evening he had experienced in years. Months passed. Summer came and went. Jane became more than a tutor. She was a presence in the house that felt essential, a calm in the storm that Andrew hadn't realized he still carried inside him. One morning, as they walked together through the garden, Lily ran ahead and said, half joking, half serious, "Are you gonna marry her, or what?" Andrew laughed, but something about the question stayed with him. It wasn't just a child's teasing curiosity. It was approval. Hope. An invitation. Eventually, he asked. Not with roses or rehearsed words, but with quiet certainty. They were sitting on the back porch, the girls playing in the yard, and he looked at Jane and said, "I don't know what this is supposed to look like, but I know what it feels like. And I know that I don't want to do any of it without you." She didn't answer with a yes or a no at first. She just leaned into him, her hand finding his, and stayed there. That was enough. The wedding was small, just the girls, a few friends, and the late afternoon sun. There were no extravagant decorations, no media, no business partners. Just a garden, a soft breeze, and the simple promise of love rebuilt from the ruins of old betrayals. And when the girls hugged them both after the ceremony, Andrew realized that every loss, every moment of doubt and heartbreak, had led him here, not to a perfect ending, but to a real one. One rooted in trust, in choice, and in the family they had created together from the pieces no one else saw coming. It had been 6 years since that evening at the fountain, the night 2 little girls in worn jeans and pink t-shirts had stopped a man in a light brown suit and warned him about a danger he hadn't yet seen. So much had changed since then that sometimes Andrew struggled to believe the life he was living now was built on the ruins of that moment. But it was. Every part of it, his new family, the peace in his heart, the quiet joy that had taken root in his home, could be traced back to that warning spoken with childlike honesty and unshakable conviction. What began as a fracture in his world had become the foundation of something real, something lasting. Andrew sat on the back patio of his house on a mild spring evening, a book open on his lap, though he wasn't reading. The scent of lemon blossoms from the trees in the yard drifted on the breeze. In the distance, he could hear the soft sound of a piano, Sophie practicing for an upcoming recital. She had insisted on teaching herself Beethoven after falling in love with classical music the year before. Her dedication reminded him of himself at that age, driven, focused, unwilling to do anything halfway, but her reasons were different. She wasn't chasing approval. She was chasing understanding. Lily was somewhere in the garage, working on a model for a sustainable housing project she had entered into a national competition. She was now 13, opinionated, fearless, and already speaking confidently about architecture schools and humanitarian design. She had found a passion that gave her purpose, a world to build that made her feel safe and powerful. Every time Andrew looked at her hands covered in pencil smudges and glue, he felt an indescribable pride. Not just for what she was doing, but for how far she had come. Inside the house, Jane was baking a cake with their youngest, Andrew, and Jane's son, Michael, who had just turned 4. He was loud, joyful, a blur of energy and endless questions. He had his mother's calm eyes and Andrew's deep laugh, and he adored his older sisters with a devotion that made Andrew's heart ache with gratitude. The house, once a symbol of silence and solitude, had transformed into a place filled with warmth, with stories, with layers of memory being made day by day. Andrew rose from his chair and stepped inside. The kitchen was a beautiful chaos of flour and frosting. Jane wore one of his old shirts over her clothes like an apron, and Michael stood on a stool beside her, covered in chocolate. She looked up and smiled when she saw Andrew, and for a moment, all the noise in his mind vanished. It still amazed him, how steady she was, how much love she had poured into the life they'd built without ever demanding more than what was freely given. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, Andrew and Jane sat on the edge of the bed, the quiet between them familiar and easy. He spoke softly, remembering aloud how it had all begun, not the betrayal, but the moment that saved him. Jane listened, her hand wrapped around his, and when he finished, she simply said, "You listened to them. Most wouldn't have." That truth still humbled him. He hadn't saved those girls. They had saved him. But they had also allowed him to save them back, and in that mutual exchange of faith, something extraordinary had grown. The foundation they had laid together extended far beyond their home. The Street Voices Foundation, which Andrew had launched shortly after adopting the girls, had expanded to multiple cities. It offered education, housing, legal support, and mentorship for homeless youth. Sophie had recently spoken at one of its events, delivering a speech that moved hardened executives to tears. She spoke not about being rescued, but about being seen. She said, "The day someone believes you exist is the day your story really begins." That line had stayed with everyone who heard it, especially Andrew. As the house fell into sleep, Andrew stepped once more out onto the patio, the stars just beginning to pierce the velvet sky. He thought about everything he had lost, trust, certainty, people he once considered unshakable, and then about everything he had gained. Love, family, purpose. He thought about Lily and Sophie and how their voices, tiny but certain, had cut through the noise of power and deception. He thought about Jane, about their quiet partnership, and about the home they had made together not just from comfort, but from truth. There was no perfect ending, no moment when the past erased itself. But there was this, a life rebuilt with intention, a family formed by choice, and a future shaped by the courage of 2 children who dared to speak up when no one else would. Andrew smiled, closed his eyes, and let the stillness wrap around him. Not the cold kind that once echoed through empty halls, but the kind that comes when everything, finally, is in its right place. This story is ultimately about the quiet power of truth and the unexpected places it comes from. It begins in a world of wealth and illusion, where betrayal wears a polished smile and danger hides behind loyalty. But what makes the ending powerful isn't just that the villain is unmasked or the hero survives. It's that healing comes not through revenge or success, but through connection, genuine, raw, human connection. The most striking part, to me, is that the ones who changed everything weren't powerful or influential. They were two forgotten girls, invisible to most, but courageous enough to speak when it mattered. And that's what lingers after the last page, the idea that sometimes the smallest voices can steer the biggest lives. Andrew didn't just rebuild his world, he rebuilt himself, not into the man he was before the betrayal, but into someone far greater. Not despite the pain, but because of it. It's not a fairy tale. It's something better, a story where love is earned, trust is rebuilt, and hope returns in the most unexpected way. He ordered movers for his $1 million home, but when two little boys showed up carrying boxes, his entire past came crashing back. The morning was crisp, with a soft breeze rolling over the hills as Robert Harper pulled up to the driveway of his newly built estate. Everything about the house gleamed with precision and modern elegance, clean lines, glass railings, and a minimalist charm that spoke of status, wealth, and meticulous taste. Robert, dressed in a tailored light suit that perfectly complemented his deep blue eyes and dark hair, stepped out of his car with a sense of pride and expectation. This home was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter, something cleaner, simpler, a reward for years of sacrifice and relentless pursuit of success. He checked his watch and glanced toward the street, expecting to see a team of professional movers arrive in one of the company trucks he had hired. But instead, what approached made him take a step forward and narrow his eyes in disbelief. Two small boys, no older than 7, were walking toward the driveway. They wore identical navy blue coveralls over slightly dirty white t-shirts. On their heads were matching blue baseball caps, pulled low over their brows, but even from a distance, Robert could see their eyes. They were a light, piercing blue, oddly familiar. Each boy carried a large cardboard box, arms strained slightly under the weight, but neither of them hesitated or complained. They moved with quiet determination, like boys who had done this before and had no intention of slowing down. Robert walked toward them quickly, disbelief giving way to concern. When they set the boxes down on the stone pathway with care and prepared to go back for more, he stepped in front of them. "What are you doing?" he asked, trying not to sound harsh but unable to hide the edge in his voice. "These boxes are heavy. You're just kids." One of the boys looked up at him with steady, clear eyes and replied, "We're working. Our mom is sick. We need to earn money." The answer hit him like a jolt. Robert stared at them, heart stuttering slightly, unsure of what to say. There was no adult in sight. No supervisor, no moving truck, just these two small boys, lifting and carrying items clearly not meant for children. Their faces were flushed, but they didn't seem scared or desperate. Only focused. Prepared. "Where are the movers?" he asked more to himself than to them. "We came instead," said the smaller boy. "Please don't send us away. We can finish the job." Robert was struck by the way they spoke, respectful, but too mature for their age. He crouched down, eye level now, and asked gently, "Where's your mother?" The older one hesitated, then answered, "She's at home. She doesn't know we're doing this." "What do you mean she doesn't know?" "She's sick. She sleeps a lot. She thinks we're out with friends, but we wanted to help. We need money for food, for medicine." Something inside Robert began to unravel. He was a man used to logic, structure, clarity, but in that moment, nothing made sense. These children didn't belong here, carrying furniture into a millionaire's home. And yet, here they were, doing it with more integrity and courage than most adults he knew. "Where do you live?" he asked. In the neighborhood. Not far, the smaller one said, suddenly looking wary. Robert stood up, his voice firm but calm. I want you to take me there. They looked at each other, a silent exchange passing between them. Finally, they nodded. The older boy picked up his box again, not because he was told to, but because he didn't want to leave anything unfinished. Robert gently took it from him, and the boy let go with hesitation. They led him down the hill, past the wealthy homes and pristine lawns, until the pavement turned to cracked asphalt and the fences lost their polish. What waited at the end of that short walk would change everything Robert thought he knew about the past, about himself, and about what it meant to truly start over. The boys led Robert down a narrow side street lined with aging homes and neglected front yards. The neighborhood stood in stark contrast to the modern estate he had just left behind. There were rusted fences, chipped paint, and sagging porches with broken steps. Yet the boys walked with quiet familiarity, clearly used to every uneven sidewalk and creaky gate they passed. Robert followed closely, carrying the box one of them had been holding, still trying to process the surreal shift in his day. Less than an hour ago, he was mentally planning where to place his designer couch and which hallway to hang his art collection in. Now he was walking through a rundown neighborhood behind two small children he had never met, toward a house that seemed to hold answers he hadn't known he was looking for. They stopped in front of a one-story house with weathered siding and a screen door that hung crookedly on one hinge. The front yard was littered with a few forgotten toys and a broken tricycle. There was a thin curtain drawn tightly across the window, and the mailbox leaned to one side, stuffed with unopened letters. The older boy pulled out a key from under a flower pot and opened the front door quietly, glancing back at Robert as if to silently ask him not to make noise. The air inside was warm but stale, heavy with the scent of medicine, dust, and something faintly sweet, like old flowers. The living room was small, cramped with second-hand furniture and an old TV balanced on a stack of crates. A few dishes sat in the sink in the attached kitchen, and there were crayons scattered on the coffee table along with a stack of wrinkled papers, drawings, Robert realized, some of them crumpled, others colored carefully in bright reds and blues. The boys motioned for him to follow them down the short hallway. They stopped in front of a bedroom door that was partially ajar. The older one pushed it open just enough for them to slip inside, and Robert stepped in after them, his heartbeat strangely loud in his ears. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a small lamp in the corner. On the bed lay a woman, thin, pale, and unmoving. Her breathing was shallow, and she seemed lost in a restless sleep. A damp cloth rested on her forehead, and there were prescription bottles lined up neatly on the nightstand. The sight of her stopped Robert cold. His throat tightened as he stepped closer. He recognized her instantly. It was Sophie. He hadn't seen her in over 7 years, but her face was etched into his memory as sharply as ever. She looked different now, worn down by time and illness, but her features hadn't changed. The curve of her lips, the line of her brow, the same soft wave in her dark hair. His breath caught in his chest, and he stared at her as if seeing a ghost. Sophie. The woman he had once loved. The woman he had left. He didn't speak, afraid that even the sound of his voice might shatter the fragile quiet in the room. He turned slowly to the boys, and suddenly the pieces started falling into place. The blue eyes. The dark hair. The shape of their faces. They weren't just familiar, they were his. His blood. His children. He felt dizzy, like the air had been pulled from the room. His knees buckled slightly, and he sat down on the edge of the nearby chair without thinking. The older boy stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the silence, and spoke carefully. She's been sick for a while. She gets dizzy. Sometimes she sleeps all day. We try not to bother her. Robert stared at him, barely able to speak. What are your names? I'm Joshua, the boy said. He's Lucas. Robert felt those names hit him like thunder. Sophie used to say if they ever had kids, she liked the name Joshua. He had brushed it off at the time. It had felt like fantasy. Like a conversation that didn't belong in the fast-moving world of deals, deadlines, and ambition. And now, standing in front of him, was the boy she had dreamed of, with his name. "Does she know?" he asked, barely able to get the words out. "Does your mom know you're doing this? Working? Carrying boxes?" Lucas shook his head. "No. We don't want her to worry." Robert rubbed his face with his hands, trying to catch up to what was happening. His mind was racing with questions, guilt, disbelief. He hadn't known. He hadn't even suspected. Sophie had vanished from his life quietly, completely. And he had let her go, thinking she had chosen silence. He had never imagined she was carrying not one, but two new lives inside her. His sons. He stood slowly and approached the bed, looking down at Sophie with 1,000 things he wanted to say, none of which would undo the years of absence. She stirred slightly, her brows twitching as if caught in a half-dream, but she didn't wake. He turned back to the boys, swallowing hard. "Do you have food? Heat? Do you go to school?" Joshua nodded. "Most days. Sometimes we miss if mom's too sick to walk us." Robert closed his eyes for a moment and steadied himself. His entire world had shifted in the space of 10 minutes. He had thought today would be about furniture and floor plans. But it had become the day he met his sons for the first time, and found the woman he should never have left. And now, whether he was ready or not, he knew he couldn't walk away again. Robert didn't sleep that night. He returned to his new, pristine house, but it felt hollow, like an empty shell he had decorated for someone who no longer existed. He sat on the edge of his luxury mattress in silence, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of what had just unraveled. The discovery of Sophie and the boys had shaken him more deeply than he could admit, even to himself. For years, he had convinced himself that walking away from that relationship had been necessary, an unfortunate but logical decision. He had wanted to succeed, to build something great, to reach the top without anything holding him back. He had told himself Sophie deserved better than the half-attention of a man married to his career. But now he realized the truth wasn't as noble. He hadn't left because she deserved better, he had left because he had been afraid. Afraid of permanence. Afraid of responsibility. Afraid of the life he had now stumbled into without warning. That morning, as sunlight crept through the tall windows of his new home, Robert didn't prepare for meetings or check his emails like usual. Instead, he drove to a grocery store, filled 2 carts with food, toiletries, and a few small toys, and returned to the boys' neighborhood. When he knocked on the door, Joshua opened it, still in pajamas, his expression unreadable but not surprised. Robert stepped inside and gently handed him a warm bag with breakfast sandwiches and orange juice. The boy took it quietly and walked it to the kitchen without asking questions. Lucas peeked from behind a doorway, his hair tousled and eyes still heavy with sleep. Sophie was awake this time. She was sitting up in bed with a blanket around her shoulders, her face pale and tired but alert. When she saw Robert in the doorway, she stiffened. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice rough from sleep and emotion. Robert stepped into the room slowly. "I know. But I couldn't not come." She glanced toward the hallway. "Did they tell you everything?" "Enough," he said. "Enough to realize I have 2 sons I've never known. Enough to see that I left more behind than I ever imagined." Sophie sighed and looked down at her hands. "I didn't tell you because I thought you didn't want to be part of anything that wasn't on your terms. I figured if you wanted to come back, you would have. But you didn't." "I didn't know," he admitted. "If I had, I..." She looked up sharply. "You don't get to rewrite the past, Robert. You left. That's what you chose." He nodded, accepting the truth in her words. "You're right. I did. And it was the worst decision I ever made. But I'm not here to rewrite anything. I'm here because I want to help now. I want to be here now. Sophie's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained cautious. Why now? Guilt? Charity? No, he said quietly. Because I walked into that house yesterday expecting furniture and ended up finding a family I didn't know I had. And now I can't go back to pretending I'm alone in this world. She closed her eyes, as if the weight of his words was too much to hold. After a moment, she said, I can't rely on someone who might disappear again. Not for me, and definitely not for them. They've been through too much already. I understand, Robert said. That's why I'm not asking for your trust right away. I'm just asking for a chance to earn it. Later that day, he stayed. He cooked lunch with what little they had in the kitchen, fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom, and swept the leaves from the front steps. He didn't do it for show. He didn't do it to prove anything. He did it because he wanted to understand what their lives had been like and where, if possible, he could fit into them now. The boys began to warm to him in subtle ways. Lucas followed him around the house, mimicking his movements. Joshua started asking questions, first about Robert's car, then about where he worked, and finally, about what kind of dad he thought he would be. Robert didn't have answers yet. But he gave them his attention, which, he was starting to realize, was something he had withheld from nearly everyone in his life. When evening came, he offered to stay and read to them. They brought out a tattered storybook, one he recognized from his own childhood. He sat between them on the worn-out couch, his voice steady, his heart unexpectedly full. Sophie watched from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, but her expression was no longer hard. It was tired, yes, but also touched by something fragile. Something that looked almost like hope. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep, Robert lingered at the door. Sophie walked him out, holding her sweater close against the evening chill. You don't have to do this, she said softly. I know, he replied. But I want to. She studied him for a long moment. Don't make them promises. Just be there. I will, he said, and for the first time in years, he truly meant it. The days that followed fell into a fragile but steady rhythm, as if the universe itself was cautiously watching to see what Robert would do next. Each morning, instead of driving to meetings or boardrooms, Robert found himself pulling up to the modest house in the quiet neighborhood that had suddenly become more real to him than anything money had ever bought. He didn't arrive with grand gestures or promises. He brought breakfast some mornings, helped with homework in the afternoons, and fixed the broken curtain rods and squeaky door hinges in between. It was strange how quickly he adapted to a life so far removed from the world of marble floors and catered dinners. What surprised him more was how natural it felt. There was no press, no schedule, no performance, just the slow, uncertain process of being present. Joshua and Lucas were still cautious, though they no longer flinched when he entered a room. They asked more questions, sought his attention, and began testing his patience in subtle ways, as children often do when trying to gauge the limits of trust. Lucas once knocked over a glass of juice and waited to be yelled at. Robert simply cleaned it up with a towel and asked him if he was okay. That moment changed something between them. Joshua challenged Robert to a game of chess and grinned when he won, telling him, "You're not bad, for someone who probably hasn't played in years." They were still testing, still measuring. But with every small gesture, every quiet afternoon spent at the kitchen table or in the backyard throwing a ball, they allowed him just a little more space in their lives. Sophie watched from a distance. She had grown thinner from the illness, her cheeks a little sunken, but her eyes had gained a clarity Robert hadn't seen in years. She didn't speak much about the past, and Robert didn't push. They lived in the present now, as if acknowledging too much of what had been would collapse the fragile structure they were trying to rebuild. Occasionally, their conversations would drift into deeper waters, quiet, guarded exchanges about what went wrong, what they had wanted, what they had feared. But mostly, they focused on the boys, their routines, their needs, and the moments that felt the most real. One afternoon, Robert arrived with a small box wrapped in brown paper. It wasn't expensive. Inside were 2 matching backpacks, the boys' names embroidered on them. Lucas tore into his first and shouted with delight. Joshua examined his more carefully, but the way he held it said more than words could. Sophie raised an eyebrow when she saw them but didn't say anything until later, when the boys were outside playing. "You're doing a lot," she said as she leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. "More than I expected." "I'm not trying to win you over with things," Robert said. "I just want to be useful." "It's not about the backpacks," she said quietly. "It's about how they look at you. They're starting to believe again. That's a big thing to carry." Robert looked down, his voice low. "I know. I carry it with both hands." That night, as he was getting ready to leave, Sophie stopped him at the door. "Are you serious about staying involved? Even when things get complicated?" He looked at her, surprised by the question. "Yes. Even then. Especially then." She studied him for a long time, then nodded. "Then maybe we should talk about long-term things. Legal things." He understood what she meant. Shared custody. Medical decisions. School forms. The logistics of parenthood that don't come with fanfare but hold more weight than most vows. And just like that, the door opened a little wider. The next morning, he called his lawyer. Not because he wanted control, but because he wanted recognition. He wanted the law to reflect what his heart had already accepted, that those boys were his sons, not just by blood, but by choice. By presence. By love. As December neared, the house began to change. It wasn't sudden. But there were signs. Sophie started smiling more. The boys began leaving their drawings on the fridge instead of hiding them away. A small artificial Christmas tree appeared in the corner of the living room. There was no discussion about it, no ceremony, just Lucas saying, "We should have won this year," and Robert returning an hour later with a box full of lights and ornaments. The 4 of them decorated it together, in the soft glow of evening. Music played low from an old radio. Robert held Lucas up to hang the star at the top while Joshua arranged presents beneath it, 2 of which were carefully wrapped packages Robert had seen them hide earlier that day. Later, Sophie sat on the couch, her feet curled beneath her, watching the boys play. "You know," she said, almost as if to herself, "I never thought we'd have a tree again." Robert didn't reply right away. He just sat beside her and watched the blinking lights reflect in the boys' eyes. "Neither did I," he finally said. "But I'm glad we do." Winter settled in slowly, bringing with it colder mornings, shorter days, and a new layer of quiet in the neighborhood where Sophie and the boys lived. The house remained modest and worn, but something within its walls had changed. The energy felt different now, less heavy, more alive. Robert became part of that atmosphere, not as a visitor, but as someone slowly weaving himself into the fabric of their everyday life. It wasn't something anyone officially declared. It simply happened. He showed up before school to help make breakfast or drive the boys when Sophie was too tired. He stayed late some nights when the heater made strange noises or when Lucas had a nightmare. He didn't try to take over, didn't pretend to have all the answers. He just stayed. Consistently. Quietly. One particularly cold evening, Sophie sat at the kitchen table while Robert helped the boys with a science project on the floor. They were building a model of the solar system using foam balls and a lot of messy glue. Lucas kept asking why Pluto didn't count anymore, and Joshua, ever the older brother, insisted that science changed its mind. Sophie watched them for a long time, resting her cheek against her palm. The image in front of her felt surreal, 2 sons and their father, together, laughing, arguing, making something from nothing. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe it could last. After the boys went to bed, Sophie offered Robert a cup of tea, and they sat in the small living room under a blanket that was too thin for winter but familiar. The light from the tree blinked softly in the corner, and a radio hummed faintly in the background. For a while, they didn't talk. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who no longer need to fill every gap with explanation. Eventually, Sophie broke it. "I used to imagine this," she said, staring at her mug. "Not the exact moment, not the house or the tree. Just, this feeling. You being here. The boys not having to carry everything alone." Robert turned toward her. "I wish I had come sooner. If I'd known." She shook her head gently. "You didn't know. And maybe that's part of it. Maybe we weren't ready back then. I was angry for a long time, but now. I'm just grateful. Grateful they have you. Grateful I don't have to do this alone anymore." Her voice cracked a little at the end, and she quickly took a sip of tea to hide it. Robert didn't reach for her hand or say anything comforting. He just stayed next to her, quiet and steady. That, he had learned, meant more to Sophie than any apology or promise. A few days later, Sophie's health took a dip. It wasn't life-threatening, but she became weaker, more fatigued. The doctor warned it could be a recurring condition, something she'd need long-term management for. She took the news quietly, nodding, asking all the right questions, but Robert could see the fear beneath the calm. When they got home, she tried to pretend nothing had changed. She made dinner, helped with homework, folded laundry. But he saw the way her hands trembled, how her breath shortened when she bent to pick something up. One night, after the boys were asleep, she sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the floor. "What if I can't do this? What if I get worse?" Robert knelt in front of her. "Then we adjust. We get help. We lean on each other." She met his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she let him see how scared she was. "I've always had to be the strong one. I don't know how to stop." "You don't have to stop being strong," he said. "You just don't have to be strong alone." In the days that followed, he took on more. He arranged for a part-time nurse to check in weekly, signed up the boys for after-school programs, and started preparing meals with Lucas, who had quickly declared himself sous chef. The boys noticed the change, but they didn't ask questions. They simply adapted, and that said more about the kind of resilience they had learned growing up than anything else. As Christmas approached, Robert suggested they spend it together in his house. It was larger, warmer, with more space for the boys to run around. Sophie hesitated, not because she didn't want to go, but because the idea of stepping into Robert's new life felt like crossing an invisible line, one she wasn't sure she belonged on. But Joshua was the one who decided for all of them. "I want us to all be together," he said simply. "Like a real family." So they packed up a few bags, bundled into the car, and drove through softly falling snow to the house on the hill, the house that had once been just a symbol of Robert's ambition but now stood as a beacon for something much greater. That Christmas morning, the boys tore open gifts in front of a roaring fire, their faces lit with excitement and joy. Sophie watched from the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes filled with quiet emotion. Robert stood nearby, coffee in hand, not saying much. He didn't need to. The boys' laughter, the warmth of the room, the sound of music playing low in the background, it all said enough. Later, as they sat down to eat a meal they had cooked together, Sophie looked at Robert and, without any ceremony or build-up, simply said, "Thank you." He looked back at her and replied, "You don't need to thank me. I'm home now. And I'm staying." The days after Christmas felt suspended in a quiet kind of magic. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the hills around Robert's house in soft white, and the world outside seemed to slow down. Inside, the warmth of something deeper had begun to take root, routine, familiarity, and a sense of peace that none of them had realized they'd been craving for years. The house, once a cold symbol of Robert's success, now felt lived in. There were mismatched socks by the fireplace, empty mugs left on side tables, stray Lego bricks underfoot. Joshua and Lucas no longer knocked on Robert's door before entering his office, they just burst in with drawings or questions or stories. And Robert welcomed every interruption with a smile that had become less practiced and more genuine. Sophie was still recovering, her strength returning in waves rather than a steady climb, but her laughter was easier now, and the tiredness in her eyes was replaced by something much softer, acceptance, maybe even hope. She started painting again, using a small corner of Robert's home office, which he cleared without hesitation the moment she mentioned wanting a space of her own. He bought her new brushes, canvases, and oils, then left her to it, never hovering. She would lose herself in color for hours, and when she emerged, she was lighter somehow, as though the weight of the past was being drained through the tips of her fingers and onto the canvas. One morning, while Lucas was upstairs working on a school project and Joshua was reading on the rug, Sophie and Robert found themselves alone in the kitchen, the quiet between them gentle and full. She leaned against the counter with a cup of tea while he dried dishes. It felt natural. Domestic. Something unremarkable and yet deeply important. "I've been thinking," Sophie said after a moment. Robert looked over, eyebrows slightly raised. About? About the boys. About us. About what comes next. He set the dish towel down and turned to face her fully, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "They need stability," she continued. "Not just now, but going forward. If something happens to me, if I can't." He stepped closer before she could finish the sentence. "Don't talk like that. You're getting better." "I am. But life doesn't always ask what we're ready for. We have to plan. I've started speaking with a family attorney about formalizing your rights. Joint custody. Shared guardianship. Something legal and lasting. If you're still willing." His answer came without hesitation. "Yes. Of course, I am." "It's not just paperwork, Robert," she said. "It's a commitment. Not just to them, but to being part of a life that's messy and unpredictable and sometimes exhausting." He gave her a small, knowing smile. "That's the only kind of life I want now." The legal process began that week. Robert's lawyer, surprised but respectful, worked quickly. Sophie was cautious but thorough. They didn't rush it, and they didn't make it dramatic. There were no long speeches or emotional declarations, just signatures, conversations, and quiet understanding. When the paperwork was finally signed and filed, Robert sat in the car outside the courthouse, holding the final copy in his hands. It wasn't just a document. It was a bridge, one built slowly, carefully, from the wreckage of their past towards something steady and real. Joshua and Lucas didn't fully understand what had changed, but they sensed the difference. They felt it in the way Robert now answered calls from their school. In how he helped with dentist appointments. In how his name began appearing on permission slips. More importantly, they saw it in how their mother looked at him, with trust. One weekend, after the papers were finalized, they went sledding together at a nearby park. The boys raced down icy hills while Robert and Sophie stood at the bottom, laughing and catching their breath. Lucas ran up to Robert and grabbed his hand without thinking, tugging him toward the sled. "Your turn, Dad." The word hung in the air for a second. Robert hadn't heard it before from either of them, at least not like that. But Lucas said it easily, naturally, as though it had always belonged to him. Robert looked at Sophie, who nodded, her eyes glassy but smiling. He climbed onto the sled with Lucas and, for a moment, felt more weightless than the snowflakes falling around them. Later that evening, as the fireplace crackled and the boys played a board game on the floor, Robert sat beside Sophie on the couch. She leaned her head on his shoulder, something she hadn't done in years, and they watched the fire together. "You're not just a guest in this life anymore," she said softly. "You're part of it now." I know, he replied. And I never want to leave it again. The house was quiet except for the muffled sound of children's laughter and the settling creaks of a home full of life. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, everything felt warm and steady. They didn't need to say what they already knew, that something beautiful had taken root, born from something broken, rebuilt by presence, patience, and love. Spring arrived not with grand fanfare but gradually, with sunlight lasting a little longer each evening and the wind no longer biting at their faces during early morning walks. The snow had melted into memory, and the trees outside Robert's house began to blossom with fragile pink buds. There was something symbolic about the season this year, something more than warmth or flowers. It felt like confirmation that everything they had been trying to build was finally beginning to hold its shape. Life, still imperfect and filled with unpredictable rhythms, had settled into something steady. The boys had become completely comfortable in Robert's presence. Joshua no longer hesitated before asking for help with his science homework, and Lucas had developed the habit of crawling into Robert's lap without warning during family movie nights. There were still the usual tantrums and sibling squabbles, the occasional burst of energy that left the living room looking like a storm had passed through it. But there was laughter, loud and honest, filling the house with sounds it had never known before. For Robert, those ordinary sounds were now the most extraordinary thing in his life. Sophie had regained more of her strength. The treatments had been working slowly, her health stabilizing with rest, care, and the security that she was no longer carrying everything alone. She had even reopened a small online art shop, selling prints of her paintings. Robert had insisted she set up a proper space in his home, now their shared home. He converted the sunroom into a studio, where soft light streamed through large windows and turned her canvases into portals. Her hands, once trembling from exhaustion, now moved confidently with brushes, blending color into emotion. It had become her sanctuary. And whenever he watched her paint, he felt both awe and regret for all the years he had missed, awe that she still allowed him to stand beside her now. They had not spoken about love, not directly. There had been no dramatic confessions, no romantic promises whispered late at night. What had grown between them came from presence, not performance. One evening, while folding laundry side by side, Sophie looked over and said, "It doesn't feel like you're visiting anymore. It feels like you live here." Robert had smiled gently. "That's because I do." The legal transition had passed quietly, but it had altered everything. Robert was now listed as emergency contact at school, on medical forms, at summer camp registration. More importantly, he was a father in the boys' eyes, not a visitor or a helper, but a fixture. A man they expected to see when they woke up and when they fell asleep. One day, while waiting in line for snow cones at the park, a stranger asked Lucas if he was with his dad. Without hesitation, Lucas pointed at Robert and said, "That's him," as casually as if it had always been true. Robert had walked home from that moment with a lump in his throat. The change was clear not only in Robert, but in how the world responded to him. His work had shifted too. He still ran his company, but his priorities had been quietly rewritten. He stopped taking evening calls when the boys had school projects. He declined business dinners that overlapped with family time. He brought Lucas to "take your kid to work" day, and let him sit in the CEO chair, watching the boy pretend to sign million-dollar contracts with crayon in hand. Joshua had spent a full afternoon in the office library, asking about charts and market strategy, trying to sound like a grown-up. Robert had never felt more fulfilled in a meeting than he had that day. One afternoon, after the boys had gone to a neighbor's birthday party and Sophie had stayed behind to finish a painting, Robert stepped out onto the back porch with 2 cups of coffee. The air smelled like wet earth and blossoms. He handed her a mug and sat beside her on the swing bench. They didn't speak for several minutes. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask for explanation. Then she said, very simply, "You've changed." Robert didn't answer right away. He let her words settle in. Then he said, "I don't think I changed. I think I finally became the version of myself I was supposed to be all along." She looked at him for a long time, and then reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "I see him. And I'm glad you found him." That night, the boys returned sticky and tired from the party, collapsing into bed with barely a protest. Robert and Sophie stayed up late talking, not just about the kids or the day, but about their memories, their regrets, and even their dreams. There was no longer a wall between past and present. There was space now, shared honestly, with no pressure to define what came next. But Robert knew what he wanted. He didn't say it yet. He didn't need to. Not in words. Instead, he showed it in how he woke up early to make Sophie tea when she had a headache. In how he carried Lucas to bed even when the boy insisted he was too big for that now. In how he stood quietly behind Sophie when she painted, just close enough for her to feel he was there. Spring was the season of beginnings, yes, but for them, it wasn't about starting over. It was about continuing forward, hand in hand, with nothing hidden and nothing rushed. And for the first time in Robert's life, continuing forward felt better than any finish line. Summer arrived with a quiet sense of triumph. The air was warmer, the skies clearer, and the days longer, filled with the kind of golden light that made everything seem a little softer, a little more hopeful. For the first time in years, Robert felt as if he could breathe deeply without the constant weight of pressure on his chest. It wasn't that life had become easy, there were still bills to pay, calls to return, unexpected colds, missed appointments, and the usual chaos of parenting two energetic boys. But there was peace now, a rhythm to it all, and something inside him had settled in a way it never had before. The boys were out of school, and the house was alive with energy. Mornings began with cereal spilled on the floor, animated arguments about who got to use the blue bowl, and last-minute plans for picnics or bike rides. Joshua had taken up reading novels far above his age level and liked to recite facts about space or historical wars over breakfast. Lucas, meanwhile, was determined to build the world's longest domino line and insisted on using every flat surface in the house as part of his construction. Robert found himself constantly navigating between awe and exhaustion, often laughing in disbelief at the beautiful mess his life had become. Sophie had grown stronger with the change of seasons. Her health had stabilized enough that she began painting for hours each day, her work more vibrant and expressive than ever. One afternoon, Robert walked into her studio and saw a new canvas leaning against the wall. It showed two boys playing in a field under a wide sky, with a man watching nearby, not posed or central, just present, quietly a part of their world. Robert recognized the scene instantly. It was them. But it wasn't a painting of reality, it was one of peace, of wholeness, of family as it should be. He said nothing, only walked over and kissed her forehead, letting the moment speak for itself. By midsummer, Robert had made a decision. It hadn't come all at once, but gradually, as each day unfolded and showed him what truly mattered. He planned everything carefully, without flash, without extravagance. He wanted it to be quiet, honest, and entirely theirs. One warm evening, while the boys were at a weekend sleepover with friends, Robert invited Sophie to the porch. Lanterns glowed softly around them, and a breeze carried the scent of jasmine through the air. They sat side by side, barefoot, sipping iced tea and talking about nothing and everything. Then Robert stood, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small velvet box, not because it was traditional, but because it was symbolic, something that had waited far too long. He knelt, not to impress or perform, but because it felt right. "I don't want to go back to how we were before," he said. "I don't want to fix something broken. I want to keep building what we've started. With you. With the boys. Not because I think it will be perfect, but because I know now that it doesn't have to be. I love this life. I love you. Will you marry me?" Sophie didn't answer right away. She stared at him for a long moment, then reached out, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had come before. She nodded, slowly at first, then with more certainty. Yes, she said. But only if you keep doing the dishes. They both laughed, and Robert stood, wrapping his arms around her as she leaned into him, their hearts full with the quiet kind of joy that doesn't need an audience. When the boys returned the next morning, Lucas noticed Sophie's ring immediately and gasped so loudly he nearly fell over. Joshua, trying to play it cool, nodded in approval but couldn't hide his smile. That night, they all sat together on the couch, watching an old movie, a blanket thrown over them like a tent, popcorn spilling everywhere. There were no fireworks, no speeches, no perfect ending. Just family. Just love. Just the ordinary miracle of people who had once been broken finding each other again, and choosing, every day, to stay. And that was more than enough. This story, at its heart, is about redemption, not the grand, cinematic kind, but the quiet, earned kind that happens slowly, over dishes washed, homework helped with, and silence shared. What makes the ending powerful isn't the proposal or the legal papers, it's the fact that a man who once ran from responsibility learned how to stay. The boys didn't just gain a father, they gained proof that people can change. Sophie didn't just accept him back, she chose to believe in a future that wasn't guaranteed. And Robert didn't just fix what was broken, he built something new, stronger because of the cracks. The ending isn't a fairy tale. It's something rarer, honest, hopeful, and deeply human.